Story 1: The Free Couch. Alyssa was a recent college graduate, just settling into her new apartment in a quiet part of town. She didn't have much furniture yet and was thrilled when she saw a Craigslist ad offering a free couch. The ad was brief and vague, but the photos showed a sturdy, clean-looking sofa in a rustic farmhouse. First come, first served, the listing had said. Excited, Alyssa quickly messaged the seller and set up a time to pick it up the next morning. The directions took her well outside the city to a rural area she wasn't familiar with, and the further she drove, the more nervous she became. The road wound through forests, the houses growing fewer and farther between. Eventually, she arrived at the location, a dilapidated farmhouse that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The door was slightly ajar. Alyssa parked and hesitantly approached the house. "Hello," she called out, but there was no response. The air was thick with unease, and every instinct told her to leave, but she was already here. Besides, it was just a couch. Maybe the seller had left it outside. She pushed the door open a little more and stepped inside. The smell hit her first, musty and rotten, like something decaying. The house was dark, and her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. She called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" Still no answer. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. She was about to turn and leave when she spotted it, the couch, sitting in the middle of the living room, just as it had been in the photos. But up close, it didn't look as clean as she had imagined. The cushions were torn, the fabric stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. She turned to leave, but as she did, she noticed something even worse. There, behind the couch, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. A man, standing completely still, watching her. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his posture was rigid, almost predatory. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, silently observing. Alyssa backed away, her heart racing, fear turning her legs to jelly. She bolted for the door, not daring to look back, but she could feel his gaze following her as she ran. She fumbled with her keys, threw herself into her car, and sped away, not stopping until she was miles down the road. She never reported it. What would she even say? But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a bad Craigslist deal. Story 2: The Job Offer. Chris was desperate for work. His rent was overdue, and he couldn't afford to be picky, so when he saw a Craigslist ad for a job as a live-in caretaker for an elderly man in a remote part of town, he applied without hesitation. The pay was decent, and the job seemed easy enough, just some light cleaning, cooking, and helping the old man with his daily routines. He drove out to the address listed in the ad, an old mansion hidden deep in the woods. The house was massive, but it had clearly seen better days. The windows were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. It felt abandoned, but Chris had come too far to turn back now. He knocked on the door, and after a long moment, it creaked open. An old man, thin and frail, with skin as pale as death, stood in the doorway. His eyes were sunken, his clothes tattered, and his voice was little more than a whisper. "You must be the new caretaker." Chris hesitated but forced a smile. "That's right. I'm here for the job." The man didn't smile back. Instead, he gestured for Chris to follow him inside. The interior of the house was even more decrepit than the outside. The air was thick with dust, and the furniture was covered in white sheets. The old man led Chris to a small room at the back of the house. "This will be your room," he said flatly. Chris nodded, setting his bag down. "So, what exactly do you need me to do?" The man's expression darkened. "Just stay in the house. Don't go into the basement. No matter what you hear." Chris's stomach twisted. The basement? The old man didn't answer. He turned and shuffled away, disappearing down the long hallway. That night, Chris lay in his bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling. He couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still, and there was something about the old man's warning that made him uneasy. Around midnight, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from below, followed by a low, guttural moan. Chris sat up, his heart pounding. He listened intently, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. He remembered the old man's warning. Don't go into the basement. But curiosity got the better of him. Chris crept down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. He found the door to the basement at the end of the hall. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a hook nearby. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and descended the creaking stairs. The basement was pitch dark, the air damp and cold. Chris fumbled for a light switch, but before he could find it, he heard a noise, a whisper, close to his ear. He froze. Suddenly, a hand, ice-cold and skeletal, grabbed his arm. Chris screamed and yanked himself free, stumbling back up the stairs. He slammed the basement door shut and locked it, his chest heaving with terror. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, Chris packed his things and left without saying a word to the old man. He didn't care about the job anymore. Whatever was in that basement was something no amount of money could make him face again. Story 3: The Roommate from Hell. After breaking up with his long-term girlfriend, Ben needed a place to stay fast. Craigslist was his best bet. He quickly found a listing for a roommate in a nice apartment downtown. The rent was cheap, the location was perfect, and the ad seemed legitimate enough. He met the current tenant, a guy named Mark, and everything seemed fine. Mark was friendly, maybe a little too friendly, but Ben figured he was just lonely and eager to have a roommate. They hit it off well enough, and Ben moved in the next week. At first, everything was great. The apartment was clean, Mark was polite, and they mostly kept to themselves. But then, little by little, things started to get weird. It began with small things, Mark hovering outside Ben's room late at night, strange sounds coming from the walls, and an odd, metallic smell that seemed to linger in the air. Ben shrugged it off at first, but as the days went by, the unease grew. One night, Ben woke up to the sound of whispering. He sat up, listening closely. It was coming from Mark's room. But it wasn't just Mark's voice, it sounded like multiple voices, murmuring in low, urgent tones. Ben pressed his ear against the wall, trying to make out what they were saying, but he couldn't understand any of it. The voices sounded almost inhuman. He tried to go back to sleep, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. Ben couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed and knocked on Mark's door. "Mark? Everything okay in there?" The whispering stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, Mark's voice, calm and eerie, drifted through the door. "Go back to bed, Ben." Chills ran down Ben's spine. He didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, Ben decided he'd had enough. He started looking for a new place to live, but before he could find anything, things took a darker turn. One night, Ben came home late from work to find the apartment in complete darkness. He called out to Mark, but there was no answer. As he moved through the apartment, the metallic smell hit him again, stronger this time, almost suffocating. He reached Mark's room and hesitated before pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the floor was covered in symbols, strange, occult symbols drawn in what looked like blood. In the center of the room was a pile of bones, human bones, arranged in a grotesque circle. Ben stumbled back, horrified, but before he could run, he heard it. The whispering. It was all around him now, louder and more intense, echoing off the walls. And then Mark appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide and crazed, a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come in here, Ben," he said, his voice a rasp. Ben ran. He didn't stop running until he was miles away from the apartment. He never went back. Story 4. The Haunted Piano. Emily had always loved music, so when she saw an antique piano for sale on Craigslist, she couldn't resist. The ad was short, offering an antique grand piano, free to a good home, must be picked up. The photo showed a beautiful, aged instrument with intricately carved wooden legs and an elegant glossy black finish. Despite its age, the piano seemed to have been well maintained. The thought of having such a gorgeous piece in her home sent her heart racing. Emily contacted the seller right away. The man, Richard, replied almost instantly, eager to get rid of it. He seemed nice enough, though his messages were terse. He explained that the piano had been in his family for generations, but after his mother passed away, he no longer had room for it in his home. Emily's excitement overrode any hesitation, and they arranged for her to pick it up the next day. The next morning, Emily drove out to a remote, rural area about an hour away from her suburban home. The directions led her to an old, sprawling estate at the end of a narrow dirt road. The house, a grand Victorian mansion, loomed large and intimidating, its once glorious exterior weathered by time. She parked her car in the gravel driveway and stepped out, feeling a slight chill despite the warm autumn sun. Richard was waiting on the porch, a tall, gaunt man in his 50s with deep-set eyes and a weary expression. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he welcomed her. "You made it," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Yeah, I'm really excited about the piano," Emily replied, glancing at the imposing mansion behind him. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Follow me," Richard said, turning and walking inside. "It's in the music room." The house was as grand as it was decayed, with high ceilings, ornate crown molding, and dusty chandeliers that cast long shadows in the dim light. Richard led her through a series of narrow hallways until they reached the music room. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the grand piano sitting in the middle of the room. Up close, the piano was even more magnificent than in the photos. The glossy black finish had dulled with age, and the keys were slightly yellowed, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. The legs were carved with intricate designs, and the lid was propped open, revealing the strings and hammers inside. Emily ran her fingers over the keys, producing a soft, haunting melody. It was out of tune, but she didn't mind. It felt right. She had always wanted a piano like this. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Richard nodded, but his expression remained tense. "It's yours if you want it. No charge, like I said." "Why are you giving it away for free?" Emily asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Richard's eyes darkened. "It's been in my family for years. But it's time for it to go. My mother, she played it every day, right up until the end." He hesitated, then added, "Let's just say, it has history. If you take it, just be careful." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine but brushed it off. "I'll take good care of it," she promised. After making arrangements with a local moving company, the piano was loaded onto a truck and delivered to Emily's house later that afternoon. She set it up in her living room, next to the large bay window that overlooked her backyard. As soon as it was in place, she sat down to play, her fingers moving across the keys with ease despite the piano's age. The first few notes she played sounded off, as if something was slightly out of tune, but she dismissed it. She would get a tuner to come by in the next few days. For now, she just wanted to enjoy her new piano. That night, after playing for hours, Emily finally went to bed, exhausted but satisfied. However, sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the haunting melodies she had played earlier. Eventually, she drifted off, only to be awakened by a strange sound in the middle of the night. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she heard it again, a soft, eerie melody drifting through the house. It was faint, but unmistakable. The piano. Emily sat up in bed, her heart racing. She strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. The house was silent again, save for the faint creaks and groans of the old wooden floors. She told herself it was nothing, probably just her mind playing tricks on her after a long day. But a deep unease settled in her chest. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Every night, without fail, Emily would wake up to the sound of the piano playing by itself. At first, she thought it might be the house settling or the wind, but the melodies were too clear, too deliberate. They were soft and haunting, echoing through the darkened rooms of her home. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that old pianos sometimes made noise due to changes in temperature or humidity. But the sounds continued, growing louder each night. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Emily sat down at the piano to play, hoping to clear her mind. As her fingers moved over the keys, she noticed something strange. The sheet music she had left on the piano earlier was gone. She searched the room but couldn't find it anywhere. She shrugged it off, thinking she might have misplaced it. But as she prepared to play, she felt a cold draft brush past her. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the room was empty. Trying to shake off the feeling, she started to play. But the moment she pressed the first key, the entire piano groaned, the sound deep and discordant, as though the instrument itself was protesting. Emily froze, her fingers hovering above the keys. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never heard a piano make a sound like that before. It was as if the piano was alive, responding to her touch with something dark and malevolent. She quickly stood up, backing away from the instrument. The house was silent again, but the oppressive feeling lingered. That night, the piano played again, louder than ever. The melody was mournful, almost like a lullaby, but there was something twisted about it. It filled the house, echoing through the hallways and seeping into Emily's dreams. She woke up drenched in sweat, the sound still ringing in her ears. This time, she couldn't brush it off. She knew something was wrong with the piano. The next morning, she called a piano tuner to come by and inspect it. The man, an older gentleman named Mr. Miller, arrived later that afternoon. He took one look at the piano and frowned. "This is an old one," he said, running his hand over the polished surface. "Where'd you get it?" "I found it on Craigslist," Emily replied, watching him closely. Mr. Miller nodded slowly. "Beautiful craftsmanship, but pianos this old, they've got a life of their own sometimes." He gave her a knowing look, one that sent a chill down her spine. As he began tuning the piano, he stopped several times, his frown deepening with each adjustment. "This piano's been through a lot," he muttered. "It's got some odd vibrations in the strings. Like, something's resonating that shouldn't be." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her stomach tightening. The tuner hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing I can't fix, but I'd be careful with it if I were you. Sometimes these old pianos carry memories, especially if they've been passed down through generations." Emily didn't ask what he meant by that, but she couldn't shake the growing feeling of dread. After Mr. Miller left, she avoided the piano for the rest of the day, unwilling to play it. That night, the melody returned, louder and more menacing than before. The sound reverberated through the walls, filling every corner of the house. It was no longer a lullaby, it was chaotic, frantic, as though something was desperately trying to escape. Emily lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the dissonant notes crash through the silence. She wanted to get up, to confront whatever was happening, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if the music had her trapped, holding her in place with its eerie power. And then, suddenly, the playing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily sat up, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She glanced at the clock, it was 3:15 a.m. Summoning every ounce of courage, she forced herself out of bed and tiptoed down the stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The piano sat in the living room, looming like a shadow in the moonlight. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lid, lifting it cautiously. Inside the piano, the strings vibrated slightly, as though they had just been played. But there was no one there. Emily stepped back, her mind racing. She had to get rid of it. Whatever was haunting this piano, it was getting stronger, more malevolent with each passing night. The next day, she posted the piano back on Craigslist, offering it for free to anyone who could come. Story 5. The Vintage Camera. Jack had been an avid photographer for years. He loved the artistry of film photography and often sought out vintage cameras for his collection. So when he found an old Leica M3 for sale on Craigslist at a price far below its market value, he jumped at the chance. The seller, a man named Marcus, claimed it had belonged to his late grandfather, who had been a professional photographer. The ad was detailed, with pictures of the camera in seemingly good condition. Jack contacted Marcus, and they agreed to meet in person to complete the sale. The meeting took place in a small, rundown cafe in the outskirts of town. Marcus, a pale man in his mid-30s, was waiting at a corner table, the camera sitting in a worn leather case beside him. Jack was immediately drawn to the camera. its sleek design and mechanical precision calling to him. He quickly handed over the cash, not wanting to lose such a deal. "Are you sure you want this?" Marcus asked as Jack packed the camera into his bag. There was an odd intensity in his eyes, something that made Jack pause. "Yeah, I'm sure," Jack replied, feeling a flicker of unease. "It's perfect for what I need." Marcus nodded slowly. "Just be careful with it. My grandfather took a lot of strange photos with that camera. Some of them, he didn't remember taking." Jack laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky story to add mystique to the sale. He waved goodbye and left the cafe, eager to try out his new camera. Later that evening, Jack loaded a fresh roll of film and set out to capture some late-night shots in the city. The streets were mostly empty, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. He snapped several photos, experimenting with angles and lighting, feeling that familiar thrill of working with film. But when he developed the pictures the next day, something was off. Among the shots of quiet streets and empty alleys, there were images he hadn't taken, distorted, nightmarish images of faces twisted in agony, dark figures lurking in the shadows, and places he had never been. The photos were grainy and blurred, but there was something undeniably wrong about them. Jack stared at the pictures, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. He knew he hadn't taken these. But how had they appeared on his film? Over the next few days, things got worse. Every time Jack took more photos with the Leica, strange images would appear. He tried using different film, different lighting, even different locations, but it didn't matter. The disturbing photos continued, dark figures growing closer in each shot, their faces becoming clearer, more menacing. He could see their eyes now, hollow and dead, staring right at him. Jack became obsessed, unable to stop himself from using the camera despite the fear gnawing at him. He started having nightmares, vivid dreams where he was being watched, pursued by shadowy figures. In one dream, he was in a dark room, surrounded by the figures from his photos. They were whispering, their voices low and urgent, telling him to stop. But he couldn't. One night, Jack woke to the sound of his camera clicking by itself. He bolted upright, heart racing, and stared at the camera sitting on his desk. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But the camera continued to click, as if someone or something was taking photos in the dark. He approached it slowly, hands trembling, and picked it up. The lens was cold to the touch, and the film was still advancing, frame by frame. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he opened the back of the camera, pulling out the roll of film. He knew he had to develop it. The pictures from that night were the worst yet. They showed his apartment, the dark corners of his bedroom, and finally, a series of shots of him, asleep in his bed. The last photo sent chills down his spine. It was a close-up of his face, taken just moments before he had woken up. Jack threw the camera away the next morning, unable to bear the thought of using it again. But the nightmares didn't stop, and neither did the feeling that he was being watched. He couldn't shake the sense that whatever had haunted the camera was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Story 6. The job listing. Marie was desperate for work. She had recently been laid off from her office job and was scrambling to find something new before her savings ran out. So when she saw a Craigslist ad for a personal assistant position with an incredibly high salary, she applied immediately. The ad was vague, mentioning only that the employer was a private individual who needed help managing personal errands and organizing a large estate. No specific qualifications were listed, and the job promised flexibility, making it sound too good to pass up. The next day, Marie received a response from someone named Mr. Chambers, offering her an interview. The instructions were simple. She was to meet him at his estate in a remote part of the countryside. Though it seemed unusual to go to someone's home for a job interview, the promise of such high pay pushed her to overlook her concerns. On the day of the interview, Marie drove for hours into increasingly rural terrain, the roads becoming narrower and more isolated. Eventually, she arrived at the estate, a massive, crumbling mansion hidden behind tall iron gates. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of the wind through the old trees. Marie hesitated at the gate, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. But she was already here. She couldn't turn back now. The gate creaked open as she approached, and a long gravel driveway led up to the house. Marie parked and walked to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked, the sound echoing eerily in the empty air. After a long moment, the door opened, revealing a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a pale, gaunt face. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Marie," he said, his voice low and slow. "Yes, I'm here for the interview," Marie replied, forcing a smile. "Come in," Mr. Chambers said, stepping aside to let her enter. The interior of the house was just as dilapidated as the outside, with peeling wallpaper, dusty furniture, and a lingering smell of dampness. As they walked through the grand foyer, Marie felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Something about the house felt wrong, as though it were watching her. Mr. Chambers led her to a small sitting room, where he offered her tea and began asking her questions about her previous jobs. The interview seemed normal at first, but as it went on, his questions grew more personal, more intrusive. "Do you live alone?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Marie hesitated. "Yes, why?" Mr. Chambers smiled again, that same hollow smile. "Good. It makes things easier." Before she could respond, he stood up abruptly. "I'll show you to the office," he said, motioning for her to follow. Marie's unease deepened as they descended a narrow staircase to the basement. The walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. She wanted to leave, but Mr. Chambers was blocking the only exit. At the bottom of the stairs, he led her into a dimly lit room filled with old filing cabinets and a large wooden desk. But it wasn't the office that caught her attention, it was the rows of photographs hanging on the walls. Dozens of them, all of different women. Women who looked just like her. Her stomach dropped as she realized they weren't just random photos. They were surveillance shots, taken without the women's knowledge. She was looking at a gallery of Mr. Chambers' victims. Marie's blood ran cold. "I think I should go," she said, backing toward the door. Mr. Chambers' smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. "I'm afraid you can't leave yet," he said, his voice icy. Marie bolted for the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear Mr. Chambers' footsteps behind her, fast and heavy. She raced up the stairs, throwing open the door and running for her car. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She never reported the incident, too terrified of what might happen if she did. But she knew she had narrowly escaped something far worse than a bad job interview. Story 7. The Haunted Doll. Sarah was a collector of antique dolls. She loved the intricate details and craftsmanship of older dolls, often scouring online marketplaces for unique additions to her collection. One evening, she came across a Craigslist ad that caught her eye, a beautiful porcelain doll, its face painted with delicate features and dressed in a Victorian-era gown. The seller claimed the doll was from the early 1900s and was in perfect condition. The price was surprisingly low, but Sarah didn't think twice. She contacted the seller and arranged to pick up the doll the next day. The meeting took place at an old thrift shop on the outskirts of town. The shop was dimly lit and cluttered with old furniture, books. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.